We will begin. And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, Chapter 10. 1. Do you believe it? Vera asked. She and Philip Lombard sat on the windowsill of the living room. Outside, the rain poured down and the wind howled in a great shuddering gust against the window panes. Philip Lombard cocked his head slightly on one side before answering. Then he said, You mean, do I believe that old Wargrave is right when he says it's one of us? Yes. Philip Lombard said slowly, It's difficult to say. Logically, he's right. And yet, Vera took the words out of his mouth. And yet it seems so incredible. Philip Lombard made a grimace. The whole thing's incredible. But after MacArthur's death, there's no more doubt as to one thing. There's no question now of accidents or suicides. It's definitely murder. 3 murders up to date. Vera shivered. She said, It's like some awful dream. I keep feeling that things like this can't happen. He said with understanding. I know. Presently, a tap will come on the door and early morning tea will be brought in. Vera said, Oh, how I wish that could happen. Philip Lombard said gravely, Yes, but it won't. We're all in the dream, and we've got to be pretty much up on our guard from now on. Vera said, lowering her voice, If it is one of them, which do you think it is? Philip Lombard grinned suddenly. He said, I take it you are accepting our 2 selves. Well, that's all right. I know very well that I'm not the murderer, and I don't fancy that there's anything insane about you, Vera. You strike me as being one of the sanest and most level-headed girls I've come across. I'd stake my reputation on your sanity. With a slightly wry smile, Vera said, Thank you. He said, Come on now, Miss Vera Claythorne. Aren't you going to return the compliment? Vera hesitated a minute. Then she said, You've admitted, that you don't hold human life particularly sacred. But at the same time, but all the same, I can see you as the man who dictated that gramophone record. Philip Lombard said, Quite right. If I were to commit 1 or more murders, it would be solely for what I could get out of them. This mass clearance isn't my line of country. Good. Good. Then we'll eliminate ourselves and concentrate on our 5 fellow prisoners. Which of them is you and Owen? Well, at a guess, and with absolutely nothing to go upon, I'd plump for Wargrave. Oh! Vera sounded slightly surprised. She thought a minute or 2, then said, Why? Hard to say exactly, but to begin with, he's an old man and he's been presiding over courts of laws for years. That is to say, he's played God Almighty for a good many months every year. That must go to a man's head eventually. He gets to see himself as all-powerful, as holding the power of life and death, and it's possible that his brain might snap and he might want to go one step further and be executioner and judge extraordinary. Vera said slowly, Yes, I suppose that's possible. Lombard said, Who do you plump for? Without any hesitation, Vera answered, Dr. Armstrong? Lombard gave a low whistle. The doctor, eh? I should have put him last of all. Vera shook her head. Oh no. 2 of the deaths have been poison. That rather points to a doctor. Then you can't get over the fact that the only thing we are absolutely certain Mrs. Rogers had was the sleeping draught that he gave her. Lombard admitted, Yes, that's true. Vera persisted. If a doctor went mad, it would be a long time before anyone suspected. And doctors overwork and have a lot of strain. Philip Lombard said, Yes, but I doubt if he could have killed MacArthur. He wouldn't have had time during that brief interval when I left him. Not, that is, unless he fairly hared down there and back again. I doubt if he's in good enough training to do that and show no signs of it. Vera said, He didn't do it then. He had an opportunity later. When? When he went down to call the general to lunch. Philip whistled again very softly. He said, So you think he did it then? Pretty cool thing to do. Vera said impatiently. What risk was there? He was the only person here with medical knowledge. He can swear the body's been dead at least an hour, and who's to contradict him? Philip looked at her thoughtfully. You know, he said, that's a clever idea of yours. I wonder. 2. Who is it, Mr. Bloor? That's, what was Roger's voice again? Who is it, Mr. Bloor? That's what I want to know. Who is it? Roger's face was working. His hands were clenched around the polishing leather that he held in his hand. Ex-Inspector Bloor said, my lad, that's the question. What of us, his lordship said? Which one? That's what I want to know. Who's the fiend in human form? That, said Bloor, is what we would all like to know. Roger said shrewdly, but you've got an idea, Mr. Bloor. You've got an idea, haven't you? I may have an idea, Bloor said slowly, but that's a long way from being sure. I may be wrong. All I can say is that if I'm right, the person in question is a very cool customer. A very cool customer indeed. Rogers wiped the perspiration from his forehead. He said hoarsely, It's like a bad dream, that's what it is. Bloor said, looking at him curiously, Got any ideas yourself, Rogers? The butler shook his head and said hoarsely, I don't know. I don't know at all. And that's what's frightening the life out of me, to have no idea. 3. Dr. Armstrong said violently, We must get out of here. We must. We must at all cost. Mr. Justice Wargrave looked thoughtfully out of the smoking room window. He played with the cord of his eyeglasses. He said, I do not, of course, profess to be a weather prophet, but I should say that it is very unlikely that a boat could reach us, even if they knew of our plight, in under 24 hours. And even then, only if the wind drops. Dr. Armstrong dropped his head into his hands and groaned. He said, And in the meantime, we may all be murdered in our beds? I hope not, said Mr. Justice Wargrave. I intend to make every possible precaution against such a thing happening. It flashed across Dr. Armstrong's mind that an old man like the judge was far more tenacious of life than a younger man would be. He had often marveled at the fact in his professional career. Here was he, junior to the judge by perhaps 20 years, and yet with vastly inferior sense of self-preservation. Mr. Justice Wargrave was thinking, Murdered in our beds. These doctors are all the same. They think in cliches. A thoroughly commonplace mind. The doctor said, There have been 3 victims already, remember? Certainly. But you must remember that they were unprepared for the attack. We are forewarned. Dr. Armstrong said bitterly, What can we do? Sooner or later. I think, said Mr. Justice Wargrave, that there are several things we can do. Armstrong said, We've no idea even who it can be. The judge stroked his chin and murmured, You know, I wouldn't quite say that. Mr. Armstrong stared at him. Do you mean you know? Mr. Justice Wargrave said cautiously. As regards actual evidence, such as is necessary in court, I admit that I have none. But it appears to me, reviewing the whole business, that one particular person is sufficiently clearly indicated. Yes, I think so. Armstrong stared at him. He said, I don't understand. 4. Miss Brent was upstairs in her bedroom. She took up her Bible and went to sit by the window. She opened it. Then, after a minute's hesitation, she set it aside and went over to the dressing table. From a drawer in it, she took out a small, black-covered notebook. She opened it and began writing. A terrible thing has happened. Jenna MacArthur is dead. His cousin married Esley McPherson. There is no doubt but that he was murdered. After luncheon, the judge made us a most interesting speech. He is convinced that the murderer is one of us. That means that one of us is possessed by a devil. I had already suspected that. Which of us is it? They are all asking themselves that. I alone know. She sat for some time without moving. Her eyes grew vague and filmy. The pencil straggled drunkenly in her fingers. In shaking loose capitals, she wrote, "The murderer's name is Beatrice Taylor." Her eyes closed. Suddenly, with a start, she awoke. She looked down at the notebook. With an angry exclamation, she scored through the vague, unevenly scrawled characters of the last sentence. She said in a low voice, "Did I write that? Did I? I must be going mad." 5. The storm increased. The wind howled against the side of the house. Everyone was in the living room. They sat listlessly, huddled together, and surreptitiously they watched each other. When Rogers brought in the tea tray, they all jumped. He said, "Shall I draw the curtains? It would make it more cheerful like." Receiving an assent to this, the curtains were drawn and the lamps were turned on. The room grew more cheerful. A little of the shadow lifted. Surely by tomorrow the storm would be over and someone would come. A boat would arrive. 1 second, I'm just gonna see if I can. Okay, never mind. Vera Claythorne said, "Will you pour out tea, Miss Brent?" The elder woman replied, "No, you do it, dear. That teapot is so heavy, and I've lost 2 skeins of my gray knitting wool. So annoying." Vera moved to the tea table. There was a cheerful rattle and a clink of china. Normality returned. Tea. Less ordinary, everyday afternoon tea. Philip Lombard made a cheery remark. Blore responded. Dr. Armstrong told a humorous story. Mr. Justice Wargrave, who ordinarily hated tea, sipped approvingly. Into this relaxed atmosphere came Rogers. And Rogers was upset. He said nervously and at random, "Excuse me, sir, but does anyone know what's become of the bathroom curtain?" Lombard's head went up in a jerk. "The bathroom curtain? What the devil do you mean, Rogers?" "It's gone, sir. Clean vanished. I was going round drawing all the curtains, and the one in the bathroom wasn't there any longer." Mr. Justice Wargrave asked, "Was it there this morning?" "Oh, yes, sir." Blore asked, "What kind of curtain was it?" "Scarlet oil silk, sir. It went with the scarlet tiles." Lombard said, "And it's gone?" "Gone, sir." They stared at each other. Blore said heavily, "Well, after all, what of it? It's mad, but so is everything else. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You can't kill anybody with an oil silk curtain. Forget about it." Roger said, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." He went out, shutting the door behind him. Inside the room, the pall of fear had fallen anew. Again, surreptitiously, they watched each other. 6. Dinner came, was eaten, and cleared away. A simple meal, mostly out of tins. Afterwards, in the living room, the strain was almost too great to be borne. At 9 o'clock, Emily Brent rose to her feet. She said, "I'm going to bed." Vera said, "I'll go to bed too." The 2 women went up the stairs, and Lombard and Blore came with them. Standing at the top of the stairs, the 2 men watched the women go into their respective rooms and shut the doors. They heard the sound of 2 bolts being shot, and then the turning of 2 keys. Blore said with a grin, No need to tell them to lock their doors." Lombard said, "Well, they're all right for the night at any rate." He went down again, and the other followed him. 7. The 4 men went to bed an hour later. They went up together. Rogers, from the dining room where he was setting the table for breakfast, saw them go up. He heard them pause on the landing above. Then the judge's voice spoke. "I need hardly advise you, gentlemen. to lock your doors. Bloor said, "And what's more, put a chair under the handle. There are ways of turning locks from the outside." Lombard said, "My dear Bloor, the trouble with you is you know too much." The judge said gravely, "Good night, gentlemen. May we all meet safely in the morning." Rogers came out of the dining room and slipped halfway up the stairs. He saw 4 figures pass through 4 doors and heard the turning of 4 locks and the shooting of 4 bolts. He nodded his head. "That's all right. That's all right," he muttered. Then he went back to the dining room. Yes, everything was ready for the morning. His eye lingered on the center plaque of looking glass and 7 little china figures. A sudden grin transformed on his face. He murmured, "I'll see no one plays tricks tonight, at any rate." Crossing the room, he locked the door to the pantry. Then, going through the other door to the hall, he pulled the door to, locked it, and slipped the key into his pocket. Then, extinguishing the lights, he hurried up the stairs and into his new bedroom. There was only one possible hiding place in it, the tall wardrobe, and he looked into that immediately. Then, locking and bolting the door, he prepared for bed. He said to himself, "No more China soldier tricks tonight. I've seen to that." Chapter 11. 1. Philip Lombard had the habit of waking at daybreak. He did so on this particular morning. He raised himself on an elbow and listened. The wind had somewhat abated, but was still blowing. He could hear no sound of rain. At 8 o'clock, the wind was blowing more strongly, but Lombard did not hear it. He was asleep again. At 9:30, he was sitting on the edge of his bed, looking at his watch. He put it to his ear, then his lips drew back from his teeth in that curious wolf-like smile characteristic of the man. He said very softly, "I think the time has come to do something about this." At 25 minutes to 10, he was tapping on the closed door of Bloor's room. The latter opened it cautiously. His hair was tousled and his eyes were still dim with sleep. Philip Lombard said, affably, "Sleeping the clock round? Well, shows you've got an easy conscience." Bloor said shortly, "What's the matter?" Lombard answered, "Anybody called you or brought you any tea? Do you know what time it is?" Bloor looked over his shoulder at a small traveling clock by his bedside. He said, 25 to 10. Wouldn't have believed I could have slept like that. Where's Rogers?" Philip Lombard said, "It's a case of echo answers. Answers where?" "What do you mean?" asked the other sharply. Lombard said, "I mean that Rogers is missing. He isn't in his room or anywhere else, and there's no kettle on, and the kitchen fire isn't even lit." Bloor swore under his breath. He said, "Where the devil can he be? Out on the island somewhere? Wait till I get some clothes on, see if the others know anything." Philip Lombard nodded. He moved along the line of closed doors. He found Armstrong up and nearly dressed. Mr. Justice Wargrave, like Bloor, had to be roused from sleep. Vera Claythorne was dressed. Emily Brent's room was empty. The little party moved through the house. Roger's room, as Philip Lombard had already ascertained, was untenanted. The bed had been slept in, and his razor and sponge and soap were wet. Lombard said, "He got up all right." Vera said in a low voice, which she tried to make firm and assured, You don't think he's hiding? You don't think he's hiding somewhere, waiting for us?" Lombard said, "My dear girl, I'm prepared to think anything of anyone. My advice is that we keep together until we find him." Armstrong said, "He must be out on the island somewhere." Bloor, who had joined them, dressed, but still unshaved, said, "Where's Miss Brent got to? That's another mystery." But as they arrived in the hall, Emily Brent came through the front door. She had on a mackintosh. She said, "The sea is as high as ever. I shouldn't think any boat could try to put out today. No. There we go. Blore said. Have you been wandering out about the island alone, Miss Brent? Don't you realize that that's an exceedingly foolish thing to do? Emily Brent said, I assure you, Mr. Blore, I am an extremely sharp lookout. Blore grunted. He said, Seen anything of Rogers? Miss Brent's eyebrows rose. Rogers? No, I haven't seen him this morning. Why? Mr. Justice Wargrave, shaved, dressed, and with all his false teeth in position, came down the stairs. He moved to open the dining room door. He said, Laid the table for breakfast, I see. Lombard said, He might have done that last night. They all moved inside the room, looking at the neatly set plates and cutlery. At the row of cups on the sideboard, all the felt mats placed ready for the coffee urn. It was Vera who saw it first. She caught the judge's arm. The grip of her athletic fingers made the old gentleman wince. She cried out, The soldiers! Look! There were only 6 china figures in the middle of the table. 2. They found him shortly afterwards. He was in a little wash house across the yard. He had been chopping sticks in preparation for lighting the kitchen fire. The small chopper was still in his hand. The bigger chopper, a heavy affair, was leaning against the door. The metal of it stained a dull brown. It corresponded only too well with the deep wound in the back of Roger's head. 3. Perfectly clear, said Armstrong. The murderer must have crept up behind him, swung the chopper once, and brought it down on his head as he was bending over. Blore was busy on the handle of the chopper and the flour sifter from the kitchen. Mr. Justice Wargrave asked, Would it have needed great force, Doctor? Armstrong said gravely, A woman could have done it, if that's what you mean. He gave a quick glance round. Vera Claythorne and Emily Brent had retired to the kitchen. The girl could have done it easily. She's an athletic type. In appearance, Miss Brent is fragile-looking, but that type of woman has often a lot of wiry strength. And you must remember that anyone who's mentally unhinged has a good deal of unsuspected strength. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Blore rose to his knees with a sigh. He said, No fingerprints. Handle was wiped afterwards. The sound of laughter was heard. They turned sharply. Vera Claythorne was standing in the yard. She cried out in a high, shrill voice, shaken with wild bursts of laughter. Do they keep bees on this island? Tell me that. Where do we go for honey? They stared at her uncomprehendingly. It was as though the sane, well-balanced girl had gone mad before her eyes. She went on in that high, unnatural voice. Don't stare like that. As though you thought I was mad. It's sane enough what I'm asking. Bees, hives, bees. Don't you understand? Haven't you read that idiotic rhyme? It's all up in your bedrooms. Put there for you to study. We might have come in here straight away if we'd had sense. 7 little soldier boys chopping up sticks. And the next verse. I know the whole thing by heart, I tell you. 6 little soldier boys playing with a hive. And that's why I'm asking, do they keep bees on this island? Isn't it funny? Isn't it damned funny? She began laughing wildly again. Dr. Armstrong strode forward. He raised his hand and struck her a flat blow on the cheek. She gasped, hiccuped, and swallowed. She stood motionless a minute. Then she said, Thank you. I'm all right now. Her voice was once more calm and controlled, the voice of an efficient games mistress. She turned and went across the yard to the kitchen, saying, Miss Brent and I are getting you breakfast. Can you bring some sticks to light the fire? The marks of the doctor's hand stood out red on her cheek. As she went into the kitchen, Blore said, Well, you dealt with that all right, Doctor. Armstrong said apologetically, I had to. We can't cope with hysteria on top of everything else. Philip Lombard said, She's not the hysterical type. Armstrong agreed. Oh no. Good, healthy, sensible girl. Just a sudden shock. Might happen to anybody. Rogers had chopped a certain amount of firewood before he had been killed. They gathered it up and took it into the kitchen. Vera and Emily Brent were busy. Miss Brent was raking out the stove. Vera was cutting the rind off the bacon. Emily Brent said, Thank you. We will be as quick as we can. Say half an hour to 3/4. The kettle's got to boil. 4. Ex-Inspector Blore said in a low, hoarse voice to Philip Lombard. Know what I'm thinking? Philip Lombard said, As you're just about to tell me, it's not worth the trouble of guessing. Ex-Inspector Blore was an earnest man. A light touch was incomprehensible to him. He went on heavily. There was a case in America. Old gentleman and his wife, both killed with an axe. Middle of the morning. Nobody in the house but the daughter and the maid. Maid, it was proved, couldn't have done it. Daughter was a respectable middle-aged spinster. Seemed incredible. So incredible that they acquitted her. But they never found any other exception. He paused. Thought of that when I saw the axe. And then when I went into the kitchen, I saw her there, so neat and calm. Hadn't turned a hair. That girl, coming all over hysterical. Well, that's natural. Sort of thing you'd expect. Don't you think so? Philip Lombard said, laconically. It might be. Blore went on. But the other, so neat and prim, wrapped up in that apron. Mrs. Rogers' apron, I suppose, saying, breakfast will be ready in a half hour or so. If you ask me, that woman's as mad as a hatter. Lots of elderly spinsters go that way. I don't mean go in for homicide on the grand scale, but go queer in their heads. Unfortunately, it's taken her this way. Religious mania. Thinks she's God's instrument. Something of that kind. She sits in her room, reading her Bible. Philip Lombard sighed and said, That's hardly proof positive of an unbalanced mentality, Blore. But Blore went on, ploddingly, perseveringly. And then she was out, in her mackintosh. Said that she'd been down to look at the sea. The other shook his head. He said, Rogers was killed when he was chopping firewood. That is to say, the first thing when he got up. The Brent wouldn't have needed to wander about outside for hours afterwards. If you ask me, the murderer of Rogers would take a jolly good care to be rolled up in bed snoring. Blore said, You're missing the point, Mr. Lombard. If the woman was innocent, she'd be too dead scared to go wandering about by herself. She'd only do that if she knew she had nothing to fear. That is to say, if she herself is the criminal. Philip Lombard said, That's a good point, yes. Hadn't thought of that. He added with a faint grin, Glad you still don't suspect me. Blore said rather shamefacedly, I did start by thinking of you. That revolver, the queer story you told, or didn't tell. But I've realized now that it was really a bit too obvious. He paused and said, Hope you feel the same about me. Philip said thoughtfully, I may be wrong, of course, but I can't feel that you've got enough imagination for this job. All I can say is that if you're the criminal, you're a damned fine actor, and I take my hat off to you. He lowered his voice. Just between ourselves, Blore, and taking into account that we'll probably both be a couple of stiffs before another day is out. You did indulge in that spot of perjury, I suppose. Blore shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. He said at last, Doesn't seem to make much odds now. Oh well, here goes. Landor was innocent right enough. The gang had got me squared, and between us, we got him put away for a stretch. Mind you, I wouldn't admit this. If there were any witnesses, finished Lombard with a grin. It's just between you and me. Well, I hope you did make a tidy bit out of it. Didn't make what I should have done. Mean crowd, the Purcell gang. Got my promotion, though. And Landor got penal servitude and died in prison. I couldn't know he was gonna die, could I? Demanded Blore. No, that was your bad luck. Mine? You mean his? His, you mean. Yours too, because, as a result of it, looks as though your own life is going to be cut unpleasantly short. Me? Blore stared at him. You think I'm going to go the way of Rogers and the rest of them? Not me. I'm watching out for myself pretty carefully, I can tell you. Lombard said, Oh well, I'm not a betting man. Anyway, if you were dead, I wouldn't get paid. Look here, Mr. Lombard, what do you mean? Philip Lombard showed his teeth. He said, Well, I mean, my dear Blore, that in my opinion, you haven't got a chance. What? Your lack of imagination is going to make you an absolutely a sitting target. A criminal of the imagination of you and Owen can make rings around you anytime he or she wants to. Blore's face went crimson. He demanded angrily. And what about you? Philip Lombard's face went hard. Dangerous. He said, I have a pretty good imagination of my own. I've been in tight places before now, and got out of them. I think I won't say more than that, but I think I'll get out of this one. 5. The eggs were in the frying pan. Vera, toasting bread, thought to herself, why did I make a hysterical fool of myself? That was a mistake. Keep calm, my girl, keep calm. After all, she'd always prided herself on her level-headedness. Miss Claythorne was wonderful. Kept her head, started off swimming after Cyril at once. I think of that now. All that was over. Over. Cyril had disappeared long before she got near the rock. She had felt the current take her, sweeping her out to sea. She had let herself go with it, swimming quietly, floating, till the boat arrived at last. They had praised her courage and her sang-froid, but not Hugo. Hugo had just looked at her. God, how it hurt, even now, to think of Hugo. Where was he? What was he doing? Was he engaged? Married? Emily Brent said sharply, Vera, that toast is burning. Oh, sorry, Miss Brent. So it is. How stupid of me. Emily Brent lifted out the last egg from the sizzling fat. Vera, putting a fresh piece of bread on the toasting fork, sat curiously. You're wonderfully calm, Miss Brent. Emily Brent said, pressing her lips together, I was brought to keep my head and never to make a fuss. Brought up to keep my head and never to make a fuss. Vera thought mechanically. Repressed as a child. That accounts for a lot. She said, God damn it. Aren't you afraid? She paused, then added, Or don't you mind dying? Dying. It was as though a sharp little gimlet had run into the solid, congealed mess of Emily Brent's brain. Dying? But she wasn't going to die. The others would die, yes, but not she, Emily Brent. This girl didn't understand. Emily wasn't afraid, naturally. None of the Brents were afraid. All her people were service people, and they faced death unflinchingly. They led upright lives, just as she, Emily Brent, had led an upright life. She had never done anything to be ashamed of, and so, naturally, she wasn't going to die. The Lord is mindful of his own. Thou shalt not be afraid by the terror of night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. It was daylight now, there was no terror. We shall none of us leave this island. Who had said that? General MacArthur, of course, whose cousin had married Elsie Macpherson. He hadn't seemed to care. He had seemed, actually, to welcome the idea. Wicked. Almost impious to feel that way. Some people thought so little of death that they actually took their own lives. Beatrice Taylor. Last night she had dreamed of Beatrice. Dreamt that she was outside pressing her face against the window and moaning, asking to be let in. But Emily Brent hadn't wanted to let her in, because if she did, something terrible would happen. Emily came to herself with a start. That girl was looking at her very strangely. She said in a brisk voice, Everything's ready, isn't it? We shall take the breakfast in. 6. Breakfast was a curious meal. Everyone was very polite. May I get you some more coffee, Miss Brent? Miss Claythorne, a slice of ham? Another piece of toast. 6 people, all outwardly self-possessed and normal. And within? Thoughts ran round in a circle like squirrels in a cage. What next? What next? Who? Which? Would it work? I wonder. It's worth trying, if there's time. My God, if there's time. Religious mania, that's the ticket. Looking at her, though. You can hardly believe it. Suppose I'm wrong. It's crazy. Everything's crazy. I'm going crazy. Wool disappearing, red silk curtains. It doesn't make any sense. I can't get the hang of it. Damned fool, he believed every word I said to him. It was easy. Must be careful, though. Very careful. 6 of those little china figures. Only 6. How many will there be by tonight? We'll have the last egg. Marmalade? Thanks. Can I cut you some bread? 6 people, behaving normally, at breakfast. Chapter 12. 1. The meal was over. Mr. Justice Wargrave cleared his throat. He said in a small, authoritative voice, I think it would be advisable. No. It would be advisable, I think, if we met to discuss the situation. Shall we say in a half-hour's time in the drawing room? Everyone made a sound of suggestive agreement. Vera began to pile plates together. She said, I'll clear away and wash up. Philip Lombard said, We'll bring the stuff out to the pantry for you. Thanks. Emily Brent, rising to her feet, sat down again. She said, Oh dear. The judge said, Anything the matter, Miss Brent? Emily said apologetically, I'm sorry. I'd like to help Miss Claythorne, but I don't know how it is. I feel just a little giddy. Giddy, eh? Dr. Armstrong came towards her. Quite natural. Delayed shock. I can give you something to... No! The word burst from her lips like an exploding shell. Took everyone aback. Dr. Armstrong flushed a deep red. There was no mistaking the fear and suspicion in her face. He said stiffly, Just as you please, Miss Brent. She said, I don't wish to take anything at all. I will just sit here quietly until the giddiness passes off. They finished clearing away the breakfast things. Fleur said, I'm a domestic sort of man. I'll give you a hand, Miss Claythorne. Vera said, Thank you. Emily Brent was left alone, sitting at the dining room. For a while, she heard a faint murmur of voices from the pantry. The giddiness was passing. She felt drowsy now, as though she could easily go to sleep. There was a buzzing in her ears. Was it a real buzzing in the room? She thought, it's like a bee. It's like a bee. A bumblebee. Presently, she saw the bee. It was crawling up the window pane. Vera Claythorne had talked about bees this morning. Bees and honey. She liked honey. Honey on the comb and strain it yourself through a muslin bag. Drip, drip, drip. There was somebody in the room, somebody all wet and dripping. Beatrice Taylor, come from the river. She had only to turn her head and she would see her, but she couldn't turn her head. If she were to call out, but she couldn't call out. There was no one else in the house. She was alone. She heard footsteps, soft, dragging footsteps coming up behind her, the stumbling footsteps of the drowned girl. There was a wet, dank smell in her nostrils. On the window pane, the bee was buzzing, buzzing, and then she felt the prick, the bee sting on the side of her neck. 2. In the drawing room, they were waiting for Emily Brent. Vera Claythorne said, Shall I go and fetch her? Flora said quickly, Just a minute. They sat down again. Everyone looked inquiringly at Flora. He said, Look here, everybody, my opinion's this. We needn't look further for the author of these deaths than the dining room at this minute. I'd take my oath that the woman's the one we're after. Armstrong said, And the motive? Religious mania. What do you say, Doctor? Armstrong said, It is perfectly possible. I've nothing to say against it, but of course we've no proof. Vera said, She was very odd in the kitchen when we were getting breakfast. Her eyes... She shivered. Lombard said, You can't judge her by that. We're all a bit off our heads by now. Fleur said, There's another thing. She's the only one who wouldn't give an explanation after that gramophone record. Why? Because she hadn't any to give. Vera stirred in her chair. She said, That's not quite true. She told me. Afterwards. Wargrave said, What did she tell you, Miss Claythorne? Vera repeated the story of Beatrice Taylor. Mr. Justice Wargrave observed, A perfectly straightforward story. I personally should have no difficulty in accepting it. Tell me, Miss Claythorne, Did she appear to be troubled by a sense of guilt or a feeling of remorse for her attitude in the matter? None whatever, said Vera. She was completely unmoved. Blore said, Heart's hard as flints, these righteous spinsters. Envy, mostly. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, It is now 5 minutes to 11. I think we should summon Miss Brent to join our conclave. Blore said, Aren't you going to take any action? The judge said, I fail to see what action we can take. Our suspicions are, at the moment, only suspicions. I will, however, ask Dr. Armstrong to observe Miss Brent's demeanor very carefully. Now let us go into the dining room. They found Emily Brent sitting in the chair in which they had left her. From behind they saw nothing amiss, except that she did not seem to hear their entrance into the room. Then they saw her face, suffused with blood, with blue lips and starting eyes. Blore said, My God, she's dead! 3. The small, quiet voice of Mr. Justice Wargrave said, One more of us acquitted. Too late. Armstrong was bent over the dead woman. He sniffed the lips, shook his head, peered into the eyelids. Lombard said, impatiently, How did she die, Doctor? She was all right when we left her here. Armstrong's attention was riveted on a mark on the right side of her neck. He said, That's the mark of a hypodermic syringe. There was a small buzzing sound from the window. Vera cried, Look, a bee, a bumblebee. Remember what I said this morning? Armstrong said grimly, It wasn't a bee that stung her. A human hand held the syringe. The judge asked, What poison was injected? Armstrong answered, At a guess, one of the cyanides. Probably potassium cyanide, same as Anthony Marston. She must have died almost immediately by asphyxiation. Vera cried, But that bee! It can't be a coincidence. Lombard said grimly, Oh no, it isn't a coincidence. It's our murderer's touch of local color. He's a playful beast. Likes to stick to his damnable nursery jingle as closely as possible. For the first time, his voice was uneven, almost shrill. It was as though even his nerves, seasoned by a long career of hazards and dangerous undertakings, had given out at last. He said violently, It's mad! Absolutely mad! We're all mad! The judge said calmly. We have, I hope, our reasoning powers. Did anyone bring a hypodermic syringe to the house? Dr. Armstrong, straightening himself, said in a voice that was not too well assured, Yes, I did. 4 pairs of eyes fastened on him. He braced himself against the deep, hostile suspicion of those eyes. He said, Always travel with one. Most doctors do. Mr. Justice Wargrave said calmly, Quite so. Will you tell us, Doctor, where that syringe is now? In the suitcase in my room? Wargrave said, We might, perhaps, verify that fact. The 5 of them went upstairs, a silent procession. The contents of the syringe were turned out. The contents of the suitcase were turned out on the floor. The hypodermic syringe was not there. 4. Armstrong said violently, Somebody must have taken it. There was silence in the room. Armstrong stood with his back to the window. 4 pairs of eyes were on him, black with suspicion and accusation. He looked from Wargrave to Vera and repeated helplessly, weakly, I tell you someone must have taken it. Blore was looking at Lombard, who returned his gaze. The judge said, There are 5 of us here in this room. One of us is a murderer. The position is fraught with grave danger. Everything must be done in order to safeguard the 4 of us who are innocent. I will now ask you, Dr. Armstrong, what drugs you have in your possession. Armstrong replied, I have a small medicine case here. You can examine it. You will find some sleeping stuff, Trianol, and sulfone tablets, a pack of bromide, bicarbonate of soda, aspirin, nothing else. I have no cyanide in my possession. The judge said, I have, myself, seen sleeping tablets. Sulfonal, I think they are. I myself have some sleeping tablets. Sulfonal, I think they are. I presume they would be lethal if sufficiently large dose were given. You, Mr. Lombard, have in your possession a revolver. Philip Lombard said sharply, What if I have? Only this. I propose that the doctor's supply of drugs, my own sulfonal tablets, your revolver, and anything else of the nature of drugs or firearms should be collected together and placed in a safe place. That after this is done, we should each of us submit to a search. Both of us, both of our persons, and of our effects. Lombard said, I'll be damned if I give up my revolver. Wargrave said sharply, Mr. Lombard, you are a very strongly built and powerful young man, but ex-Inspector Blore is also a man of powerful physique. I do not know what the outcome of struggle between you would be, but I can tell you this. On Blore's side, assisting him to the best of our ability will be myself, Dr. Armstrong, and Miss Claythorne. You will appreciate, therefore, that the odds against you, if you choose to resist, will be somewhat heavy. Lombard threw back his head. His teeth showed in what was almost a snarl. Oh, very well then, since you've got it all taped out. Mr. Justice Wargrave nodded his head. You are a sensible young man. Where is this revolver of yours? In the drawer of the bed by in the drawer of the table by my bed. Good. I'll fetch it. I think it would be desirable if we went with you. Philip said with a smile that was still nearer a snarl. Suspicious devil, aren't you? They went along the corridor to Lombard's room. Philip strode across the bed table and jerked open the drawer. Then he recoiled with an oath. The drawer of the bed table was empty. 5. Satisfied? Asked Lombard. He had stripped to the skin, and he and his room had been meticulously searched by the other 3 men. Vera Claythorne was outside in the corridor. The search proceeded methodically. In turn, Armstrong, the judge, and Blore submitted the same test. The 4 men emerged from Blore's room and approached Vera. It was the judge who spoke. I hope you will understand, Miss Claythorne, that we can make no exceptions. That revolver must be found. You have, I presume, a bathing dress with you? Vera nodded. Then I will ask you go into your room and put it on. Then come out to us here. Vera went into her room and shut the door. She reappeared under a minute dressed in a tight-fitting silk-rucked bathing dress. Wargrave nodded approval. Thank you, Miss Claythorne. Now, if you will remain here, we will search your room. Vera waited patiently in the corridor until they emerged. Then she went in, dressed, and came out to where they were waiting. The judge said, We are now assured of one thing. There are no lethal weapons or drugs in the possession of any 5 of us. That is one point to the good. We will now place the drugs in a safe place. There is, I think, a silver chest, is there not, in the pantry? Blore said, That's all very well, but who's to have the key? You, I suppose? Mr. Justice Wargrave made no reply. He went down to the pantry, and the others followed him. There was a small case there designed for the purpose of holding silver and plate. By the judge's directions, the various drugs were placed in this, and it was locked. Then, still on Wargrave's instructions, the chest was lifted to the plate cupboard, and this, in turn, was locked. The judge then gave the key of the chest to Philip Lombard, and the key of the cupboard to Blore. He said, You two are the strongest physically. It would be difficult for either of you to get the key from the other. It would be impossible for any 3 of us to do so. To break open the cupboard or the plate chest would be a noisy and cumbersome proceeding, and one which could hardly be carried out without attention being attracted to what is going on. He paused, then went on. We are still faced by one very grave problem. What has become of Mr. Lombard's revolver? Blore said, Seems to me that its owner is the most likely person to know that. A white tinge shone in Philip Lombard's nostrils. He said, You damned pig-headed fool. I tell you it's been stolen from me, Wargrave asked. When did you see it last? Last night. It was in the drawer when I went to bed, ready in case anything happened. The judge nodded. He said, It must have been taken this morning during the confusion of searching for Rogers, or after his dead body was discovered. Vera said, Must be hidden somewhere about the house. We must look for it. Mr. Justice Wargrave's finger was stroking his chin. He said, I doubt if our search will result in anything. Our murderer has had plenty of time to devise a hiding place. I do not fancy we shall find that revolver easily. Blore said forcefully, I don't know where the revolver is, but I'll bet I know where something else is. That hypodermic syringe. Follow me. He opened the front door and led the way around the house. A little distance away from the dining room, he found the syringe. From the dining room window, he found the syringe. Beside it was a smashed china figure, a broken soldier boy. Blore said in a satisfied voice, Only place it could be, after he killed her. He opened the window and threw out the syringe and picked up the china figure from the table and followed on with that. There were no prints on the syringe. It had been carefully wiped. Vera said in a determined voice, Now let us look for the revolver. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, By all means. But in doing so, let us be careful to keep together. Remember, if we separate, the murderer gets his chance. They searched the house carefully, from attic to cellars, but without result. The revolver was still missing. Alright, chapter 13. 1. One of us. One of us. One of us. The three words endlessly repeated, dinning themselves hour after hour into receptive brains. 5 people. 5 frightened people. 5 people who watched each other, who now hardly troubled to hide their state of nervous tension. There was little pretense now, no formal veneer of conversation. They were 5 enemies linked together by a mutual instinct of self-preservation. And all of them, suddenly, looked less like human beings. They were reverting to more bestial types. Like a wary tortoise, Mr. Justice Wargrave sat hunched up, his body motionless, his eyes keen and alert. Ex-Inspector Blore looked coarser and clumsier in build. His walk was that of a slow, padding animal. His eyes were bloodshot. There was a look of mingled ferocity and stupidity about him. He was like a beast at bay, ready to charge at its pursuers. Philip Lombard's senses seemed heightened rather than diminished. His eyes reacted to the slightest sound. His step was lighter and quicker. His body was lithe and graceful. And he smiled often, his lips curling back from his long white teeth. Vera Claythorne was very quiet. She sat most of the time huddled in a chair. Her eyes stared ahead of her into space. She looked dazed. She was like a bird that had dashed its head against glass and that had been picked up by a human hand. It crouches there, terrified, unable to move, hoping to save itself by its immobility. Armstrong was in a pitiable condition of nerves. He twitched and his hands shook. He lighted cigarette after cigarette and stubbed them out almost immediately. The forced inaction of their position seemed to gall him more than the others. Every now and then he broke out into a torrent of nervous speech. We shouldn't just be sitting here doing nothing. There must be something. Surely there is something that we can do. If we lit a bonfire. Blore said heavily, In this weather? The rain was pouring down again. The wind came in fitful gusts. The depressed sound of the pattering rain nearly drove them mad. By tacit consent, they had adopted a plan of campaign. They all sat in the big drawing room. Only one person left the room at a time. The other 4 waited till the 5th returned. Lombard said, It's only a question of time. The weather will clear, then we can do something. Signal, light fires, make a raft. Something! Armstrong said with a sudden cackle of laughter. A question of time? We can't afford time. We shall all be dead, Mr. Justice Wargrave said in his small, clear voice. And his small, clear voice was heavy with passionate determination. Not if we are careful. We must be very careful. The midday meal had been duly eaten, but there had been no conventional formality about it. All 5 of them had gone to the kitchen. In the larder they had found a great store of tinned foods. They had opened a tin of tongue and 2 tins of fruit. They had eaten standing around the kitchen table. Then, herding close together, they had returned to the drawing room to sit there. Sit, watching each other. And by now, the thoughts that ran through their brains were abnormal, feverish, diseased. It's Armstrong. I saw him looking at me sideways just then. His eyes are mad, quite mad. Perhaps he isn't a doctor at all. That's it, of course. He's a lunatic. Escaped from some doctor's hospital, pretending to be a doctor. It's true. Shall I tell him? Shall I scream out? No. It won't do any to put him on his guard. Besides, he can seem so sane. What time is it? Only 3:15. Oh, God, I shall go mad myself. Yes, it's Armstrong. He's watching me now. They won't get me. I can take care of myself. I've been in tight places before. Where the hell is that revolver? Who took it? Who's got it? Nobody's got it. We know that. We were all searched. Nobody can have it. But someone knows where it is. They're going mad. They're all going mad. They'll go mad. Afraid of death. We're all afraid of death. I'm afraid of death. But that doesn't stop death coming. The hearse is at the door, sir. Where did I read that? The girl. Watch the girl. Yes. Watch the girl. 20 to 4. Only 20 to 4. Perhaps the clock has stopped. I don't understand. No. I don't understand. This sort of thing can't happen. It is happening. Why don't we wake up? Wake up. Judgment Day. No. Not that. If only I could think. My head. Something's happening in my head. It's going to burst. It's going to split. This sort of thing can't happen. What's the time? Oh, God, it's only 4:15. I must keep my head. I must keep my head. If I only keep my head. It's all perfectly clear. All worked out. But nobody must suspect. It may do the trick. It must. Which one? That is the question. Which one? I think, yes. I rather think, yes, him. When the clock struck 5, they all jumped. Vera said, Does anyone want tea? There was a moment's silence. Laura said, I'd take a cup. Vera rose. She said, I'll go and make it. You can all stay here. Mr. Justice Wargrave said gently, I think, my dear young lady, we would all prefer to come and watch you make it. Vera stared, then gave a short, rather hysterical laugh. She said, Of course, you would. 5 people went into the kitchen. Tea was made and drunk by Vera and Blore. The other 3 had whiskey, opening a fresh bottle and using a siphon from a nailed-up case. The judge murmured with a reptilian smile, We must be very careful. They went back again to the drawing room. Although it was summer, the room was dark. Lombard switched on the lights, but they did not come on. He said, Of course! The engine's not been run today since Rogers hasn't been here to see to it. He hesitated and said, We could go out, get it going, I suppose. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, There are packets of candles in the larder. I saw them. Better use those. Lombard went out. The other 4 sat watching each other. He came back with a box of candles and a pile of saucers. 5 candles were lit and placed about the room. The time was 5:45. 2. At 6:20, Vera felt that to sit there longer was unbearable. She would go to her room and bathe her aching head and temples in cold water. She got up and went towards the door. Then she remembered and came back and got the candle out of the box. She lighted it, let a little wax pour onto the saucer, and stuck the candle firmly to it. Then she went out of the room, shutting the door behind her and leaving the 4 men inside. She went up the stairs along the passage to her room. As she opened her door, she suddenly halted and stood stock still. Her nostrils quivered. The sea. The smell of sea at St. Tredenick. That was it. She could not be mistaken. Of course, one smelt the sea on an island anyway, but this was different. It was a smell there had been on the beach that day, with the tide out and the rocks covered with the seaweed drying in the sun. Can I swim out to the island, Miss Claythorne? Why can't I swim out to the island? Horrid, whiny, spoilt little brat. If it weren't for him, Hugo would be rich, able to marry the girl he loved. Hugo. Surely Hugo was beside her. No, waiting for her in the room. She made a step forward. The draught from the window caught the flame of the candle. It flickered and went out. In the dark, she was suddenly afraid. Don't be a fool, Vera, Claythorne urged herself. It's all right. The others are downstairs, all 4 of them. There's no one in the room. There can't be. You're imagining things, my girl. But that smell of the beach at St. Tredenick, that wasn't imagined. It was true. There was someone in the room. She had heard something. Surely she had heard something. Then, as she stood there listening, a cold, clammy hand touched her throat. A wet hand, smelling of the sea. 3. Vera screamed. She screamed and screamed, screams of the utmost terror, wild, desperate cries for help. She did not hear the sounds from below, of a chair being overturned, of a door opening, of men's feet running up the stairs. She was conscious only of supreme terror. Then, restoring her sanity, lights flickered in the doorway. Candles. Men hurrying into the room. What the devil? What's happened? Good God, what is it? She shuddered, took a step forward, collapsed on the floor. She was only half aware of someone bending over her, of someone forcing her head between her knees. Then a sudden exclamation of quick, "My God, look at that!" Her senses returned. She opened her eyes and raised her head. She saw what it was the men with the candles were looking at. A broad ribbon of wet seaweed was hanging down from the ceiling. It was that which in the darkness had swayed against her throat, that which she had taken for a clammy hand, a drowned hand come back from the dead, to squeeze the life out of her. She began to laugh hysterically. She said, "It was a seaweed. Only a seaweed. That's what the smell was." And then, the faintness came over her once more. Waves upon waves of sickness. Again, someone took her head and forced it between her knees. Eons of time seemed to pass. They were offering her something to drink, pressing the glass against her lips. She smelled brandy. She was about to gulp the spirit gratefully down then. Suddenly, a warning note, like an alarm bell, sounded in her brain. She sat up, pushing the glass away. She said sharply, "Where did this come from?" Blor's voice answered. He stared a minute before speaking. He said, "I got it from downstairs." Vera cried, "I won't drink it." There was a moment's silence. Then Lombard laughed. He said with appreciation, "Good for you, Vera. You've got your wits about you. Even if you have been scared half out of your life. I'll get a fresh bottle that hasn't been opened." He went swiftly out. She said uncertainly, "I'm all right now. I'll have some water." Armstrong supported her. She struggled to her feet. She went over to the basin, swaying and clutching at him for support. She let the cold tap run and then filled the glass. Blore said resentfully, "That brandy's all right." Armstrong said, "How do you know?" Blore said angrily, "I didn't put anything in it." "That's what you're getting at, I suppose," Armstrong said. "I'm not saying you did. You might have done, or somebody might have tampered with the bottle for just this emergency." Lombard came swiftly back into the room. He had a new bottle of brandy in his hands and a corkscrew. He thrust the sealed bottle under Vera's nose. "There you are, my girl. Absolutely no deception." He peeled off the tin foil and drew the cork. "Luckily, there's a good supply of spirits in the house. Thankful of you and Owen." Vera shuddered violently. Armstrong held the glass while Philip poured the brandy into it. He said, "You better drink this, Miss Claythorne. You've had a nasty shock." Vera drank a little of the spirit. The color came back to her face. Philip said with a laugh, "Well, there's one murder that hasn't gone according to plan." Vera said, almost in a whisper, "You think that was what was meant?" Lombard nodded. "Expected you to pass out through fright? Some people would have, wouldn't they, Doctor?" Armstrong did not commit himself. He said doubtfully, Impossible to say. Young, healthy subject, no cardiac weakness. Unlikely. On the other hand, he picked up the glass of brandy that Blore had brought, dipped a finger in it, tasted it gingerly. His expression did not alter. He said dubiously, tastes alright. Blore stepped forward angrily. He said, "If you're saying that I tampered with that, I'll knock your ready block off." Vera, her wits revived by brandy, made a diversion by saying, "Where's the judge?" The three men looked at each other. "That's odd. Thought he came up with us." Blore said, So did I. What about it, Doctor? You came up the stairs behind me." Armstrong said, "I thought he was following me. Of course he'd be bound to go slower than we did. He's an old man." They looked out at each other again. Lombard said, "It's damned odd." Blore cried, "We must look for him." He started for the door. The others followed. Vera last. They went down the stairs. Armstrong said over his shoulder, "Of course he may have stayed in the living room." They crossed the hall. Armstrong called out loudly, "Wargrave! Wargrave, where are you?" There was no answer. A deadly silence filled the house, apart from the gentle patter of the rain. Then, in the entrance of the drawing room, Armstrong stopped dead. The others crowded up, looking over his shoulder. Somebody cried out. Mr. Justice Wargrave was sitting in his high-backed chair at the end of the room. 2 candles burnt on either side of him. But what shocked and startled the onlookers was the fact that he sat there robed in scarlet, with a judge's wig upon his head. Dr. Armstrong motioned to the others to keep back. He himself walked across to the silent staring figure, reeling a little as he walked like a drunken man. He bent forward, peering into the still face. Then, with a swift movement, he raised the wig. It fell to the floor, revealing a high, bald forehead. With it, in the very middle, a round, stained mark from which something had trickled. Armstrong lifted the lifeless hand and felt for a pulse. Then he turned to the others. He said, and his voice was expressionless, dead, far away, "He's been shot." Blore said, "God, the revolver!" The doctor said, still in the same lifeless voice, "Got him through the head. Instantaneous." Vera stooped to the wig. She said, and her voice shook with horror, "Miss Brent's missing gray wool." Blore said, "And the scarlet curtain that was missing from the bathroom." Vera whispered, "So this is what they wanted them for." Suddenly, Philip Lombard laughed, a high, unnatural laugh. 5 little boys going in for law. Got one in Chancery, and then there were 4. That's the end of Mr. Bloody Justice Wargrave. No more pronouncing sentence for him. No more putting on of the black cap. This is the last time he'll ever sit in court. No more summing up and sending innocent men to death. How Edward Seton would laugh if you were here. God, how he'd laugh." His outburst shocked and startled the others. Vera cried, "Only this morning you said he was the one." Philip Lombard's face changed, sobered. He said in a low voice, "I know I did. Well, I was wrong. Here's one more of us who's been proved innocent. Too late." Chapter 14. 1. They had carried Mr. Justice Wargrave up to his room and laid him on the bed. Then they had come down again and stood in the hall looking at each other. Blore said heavily, What do we do now?" Lombard said briskly, "Have something to eat. We've got to eat, you know." Once again they went to the kitchen. Again they opened a tin of tongue. They ate mechanically, almost without tasting. Vera said, "I shall never eat tongue again." They finished the meal. They sat round the kitchen, staring at each other. Blore said, "Only 4 of us now. Who will be next?" Armstrong stared. He said almost mechanically, "We must be very careful," and stopped. Blore nodded. "That's what he said. Now he's dead." Armstrong said, "How did it happen, I wonder?" Lombard swore. He said, "Damned clever double-cross. That stuff was planted in Miss Claythorne's room, and it worked just as it was intended to. Everyone dashes up here thinking she's been murdered, and so, in the confusion, someone caught the old boy off his guard." Blore said, "Why didn't anyone hear the shot?" Lombard shook his head. Miss Claythorne was screaming, the wind was howling, we were running about and calling out. No, it wouldn't be heard, he paused. But that trick's not going to work again. I'll have to try something else next. Laura said. He probably will. There was an unpleasant tone to his voice. The two men eyed each other. Armstrong said, 4 of us and we don't know which. Laura said, I know. Vera said, I haven't the least doubt. Armstrong said slowly, I suppose I do know, really. Philip Lombard said, I think I've got a pretty good idea now. Again they all looked at each other. Vera staggered to her feet. She said, I feel awful. I must go to bed. I'm dead beat. Lombard said, might as well. No good sitting and watching each other. Laura said, I've no objection, the doctor murmured. Best thing to do, although I doubt if any of us will sleep. He moved to the door. Laura said, I wonder where that revolver is now. 2. They went up the stairs. The next move was like a scene in a farce. It was a little like a scene in a farce. Each one stood with a hand on his or her bedroom door handle. Then, as though at a signal, each one stepped into the room and pulled the door shut. There were sounds of bolts and locks, of moving furniture. 4 frightened people were barricaded until morning. 3. Philip Lombard drew a breath of relief as he turned from adjusting a chair under the door handle. He strolled across to the dressing table. By the light of the flickering candle, he studied his face curiously. He said to himself, yes, this business has got you rattled, all right. His sudden wolf-like smile flashed out. He undressed quickly. He went over to the bed, placing his rich wristwatch on the table by the bed. Then he opened the drawer of the table. He stood there, staring down at the revolver that was inside it. 4. Vera Claythorne lay in bed. The candle still burned beside her, and yet she could not summon the courage to put it out. She was afraid of the dark. She told herself again and again, you're all right until morning. Nothing happened last night. Nothing will happen tonight. Nothing can happen. You're locked and bolted in. No one can come near you. And then she thought suddenly, of course, I can stay here. Stay here locked in. Food doesn't really matter. I can stay here. Safely. Till help comes. Even if it's a day or 2 days. Stay here. Yes, but could she stay here? Hour after hour. With no one to speak to. With nothing to do but think. She began to think of Cornwall, of Hugo, of what she'd said to Cyril. Horrid, whiny little boy always pestering her. Miss Claythorne, why can't I swim out to the rocks? I can. I know I can. Was it her voice that had answered? Of course you can, Cyril. Really, I know that. Can I go, Miss Claythorne? Can I go then, Miss Claythorne? Well, you see, Cyril, your mother gets so nervous about you. I'll tell you what. Tomorrow you can swim out to the rock. I'll talk to your mother on the beach and distract her attention. And then when she looks for you, there you'll be, standing on the rock waving to her. It will be a surprise. Oh, good egg, Miss Claythorne. That will be a lark. She'd said it now. Tomorrow. Hugo was going to Neuquén. When he came back, it would all be over. Yes, but supposing it wasn't. Supposing it went wrong. Cyril might be rescued in time, and then he'd say, Miss Claythorne said I could. Well, what of it? One must take some risk. If the worst happened, she'd brazen it out. How could you tell such a wicked lie, Cyril? Of course I never said any such thing. They'd believe her all right. Cyril often told stories. He was an untruthful child. Cyril would know, of course, but that didn't matter. And anyway, nothing would go wrong. She'd pretend to swim out after him, but she'd arrive too late. Nobody would ever suspect. Had Hugo suspected? Was that why he had looked at her in that queer, far-off way? Had Hugo known? Was that why he'd gone off after the inquest so hurriedly? He hadn't answered one letter she'd written to him. Hugo. Vera turned relentlessly in bed. No, she mustn't think of Hugo. It hurt too much. That was all over. Over and done with. Hugo must be forgotten. Why this evening? Had she suddenly felt that Hugo was in the room with her? She stared up at the ceiling, stared at the big black hook in the middle of the room. She'd never noticed that hook before. The seaweed had hung from it. She shivered as she remembered that cold, clammy touch on her neck. She didn't like that hook on the ceiling. It drew your eyes, fascinated you. A big, black hook. 5. Ex-Inspector Bloor sat on the side of his bed. His small eyes, red-rimmed and bloodshot, were alert in the solid mass of his face. He was like a wild boar, ready to charge. He felt no inclination to sleep. The menace was coming very near now. 6 out of 10. For all his sagacity, for all his caution and astuteness, the old judge had gone the way of the rest. Bloor snorted with a kind of savage satisfaction. What was it the old geezer had said? We must be very careful. Self-righteous, smug old hypocrite. Sitting up in a court feeling like God Almighty. He's got his all right. No more being careful for him. And now there were 4 of them. The girl, Lombard, Armstrong, and himself. Very soon another of them would go. But it wouldn't be William Henry Bloor. He'd see to that. The revolver. What about the revolver? That was the disturbing factor. The revolver. Bloor sat on his bed, his brow furrowed, his little eyes creased and puckered while he pondered the problem of the revolver. In the silence, he could hear the clock strike downstairs. Midnight. He relaxed a little now, even went so far as to lie down in his bed, but he did not undress. He lay there thinking, going over the whole business from the beginning, methodically, painstakingly, as he had been wont to do in his police officer days. It was thoroughness that had paid in the end. The candle was burning down. Looking to see if the matches were within reach of his hand, he blew it out. Strangely enough, he found the darkness disquieting. It was as though 1,000 age-old fears woke and struggled for supremacy in his brain. Faces floated in the air, the judge's face crowned with that mockery of gray wool, the cold, dead face of Mrs. Rogers, the convulsed purple face of Anthony Marston. Another face, pale, spectacle, with a small, straw-colored mustache. A face that he had seen some time or other, but when? Not on the island, no. Much longer ago than that. Funny that he couldn't put a name to it. Silly sort of face, really. Fellow looked a bit of a mug. Of course. It came to him with a real shock. Landor. Odd to think he'd completely forgotten what Landor looked like. Only yesterday he'd been trying to recall the fellow's face and hadn't been able to. And now here it was, every feature clear and distinct, as though he had seen it only yesterday. Landor had had a wife, a thin slip of a woman with a worried face. There'd been a kid, too, a girl about 14. For the first time, he wondered what had become of them. The revolver. What had become of the revolver? That was much more important. The more he thought about it, the more puzzled he was. He didn't understand this revolver business. Somebody in the house had got that revolver. Downstairs, the clock struck 1. Bloor's thoughts were cut short. He sat up on bed, suddenly alert, for he had heard a sound, a very faint sound, somewhere outside his bedroom door. There was someone moving about in the darkened house. A perspiration broke out on his forehead. Who was it moving secretly and silently along the corridors? Someone who was up to no good, he'd bet that. Noiselessly, in spite of his heavy build, he dropped off the bed with 2 strides was standing by the door listening. But the sound did not come again. Nevertheless, Bloor was convinced that he was not mistaken. He had heard a footfall just outside his door. The hair rose slightly on his scalp. He knew fear again. Someone creeping about stealthily in the night. He listened, but the sound was not repeated. Now a new temptation assailed him. He wanted, desperately, to go out and investigate. But if he could only see who it was that was prowling about in the darkness. but to open his door would be the action of a fool. Very likely that was exactly what the other was waiting for. He might even have meant Blore to hear what he had heard, counting on him coming out to investigate. Blore stood rigid, listening. He could hear sounds everywhere now. Cracks, rustles, mysterious whispers, but his dogged, realistic brain knew them for what they were, the creations of his own heated imagination. And then, suddenly, he heard something that was not imagination. Footsteps, very soft, very cautious, but plainly audible to a man listening with all his ears as Blore was listening. They came softly along the corridor. Both Lombard's and Armstrong's rooms were further from the stairhead than his. They passed his door without hesitating or faltering. And as they did so, Blore made up his mind. He meant to see who it was. The footsteps had definitely passed his door, going to the stairs. Where was the man going? Then Blore acted. He acted quickly, surprisingly so for a man who looked so heavy and slow. He tiptoed back to the bed, slipped matches into his pocket, detached the plug of the electric lamp by his bed, and picked it up, winding the flex around it. It was a chromium affair with a heavy ebonite base, a useful weapon. He sprinted noiselessly across the room, removed the chair from under the door handle, and with precaution unlocked and unbolted the door. He stepped out into the corridor. There was a faint sound in the hall below. Blore ran noiselessly in his stockinged feet to the head of the stairs. At that moment he realized why it was he had heard all these sounds so clearly. The wind had died down completely, and the sky must have cleared. There was faint moonlight coming in through the landing window. It illuminated the hall below. Blore had an instantaneous glimpse of a figure passing out through the front door. In the act of running down the stairs in pursuit, he paused. Once again he had nearly made a fool of himself. This was a trap, perhaps, to lure him out of the house. What the other man didn't realize was that he had made a mistake, had delivered himself neatly into Blore's hands. 4 of the 3 tenanted rooms upstairs, one must now be empty, and all that he had to be done was ascertain which. He went swiftly back along the corridor. He paused first at Dr. Armstrong's door and tapped. There was no answer. He waited a minute, then went to Philip Lombard's room. Here, the answer came at once. "Who's there?" "It's Blore. I don't think Armstrong is in his room." "Wait a minute." He went to the door at the end of the corridor. There he tapped. Here he tapped again. "Miss Claythorne? Miss Claythorne?" Vere's voice, startled, answered him. "Who is it? What's the matter?" "It's all right, Miss Claythorne. Wait a minute. I'll come back." He raced back to Lombard's room. The door opened as he did so. Lombard stood there. He held a candle in his left hand. He had pulled on his trousers over his pajamas. His right hand rested on the pocket of his pajama jacket. He said sharply, What the hell's all this?" Blore explained rapidly. Lombard's eyes lit up. Armstrong, eh? So he's our pigeon." He moved to the Armstrong's door. "Sorry, Blore, but I don't take anything on trust." He rapped sharply on the panel. "Armstrong? Armstrong!" There was no answer. Lombard dropped to his knees and peered through the keyhole. He inserted his little finger gingerly into the lock. He said, "Key's not in the door on the inside." Blore said, That means he locked it on the outside and took it with him." Philip nodded. "Ordinary precaution to take. We'll get him, Blore. This time we'll get him. Half a second." He raced along to Vera's room. "Vera?" "Yes?" "We're hunting Armstrong. He's out of his room. Whatever you do, don't open your door. Understand?" "Yes, I understand." "If Armstrong comes along and says I've been killed or Blore's been killed, pay no attention. See? Only open your door if both Blore and I speak to you. Got that?" Vera said, "Yes, I'm not a complete fool." Lombard said, "Good." He joined Blore. He said, "And now, after him. The hunt's up." Blore said, "We better be careful. He's got the revolver, remember?" Philip Lombard, racing down the stairs, chuckled. "That's where you're wrong." He undid the front door, remarking, "Latch pushed back so he could get in again easily." He went on, "I've got the revolver." Took it out of his pocket as he spoke. "Found it put back in my drawer tonight." Blore stopped dead on the doorstep. His face changed. Philip Lombard saw it. "Don't be a damned fool, Blore. I'm not going to shoot you. Go back and barricade yourself in if you like. I'm off after Armstrong." He thought to himself in the moonlight. He started off into the moonlight. Blore, after a minute's hesitation, followed him. He thought to himself, I suppose I'm asking for it, after all. After all, he had tackled criminals armed with revolvers before. Whatever else he lacked, Blore did not lack courage. Show him the danger and he would tackle it pluckily. He was not afraid of danger in the open, only of danger undefined and tinged with the supernatural. 6. Vera left to wait results, got up and dressed. She glanced over once or twice at the door. It was a good solid door. It was both bolted and locked and had a oak chair wedged under the handle. It could not be broken open by force, certainly not by Dr. Armstrong. He was not a physically powerful man. If she were Armstrong, intent on murder, it was cunning that she would employ, not force. She amused herself by reflecting on the means he might employ. He might, as Philip had suggested, announce that one of the other two men was dead, or he might possibly pretend to be mortally wounded himself, might drag himself groaning to her door. There were other possibilities. He might inform her that the house was on fire. More, he might actually set the house on fire. Yes, that would be a possibility. Lure the other two men out of the house, then, having previously laid a trail of petrol, he might might set light to it, and she, like an idiot, would remain barricaded in her room until it was too late. She crossed over to the window. Not too bad. At a pinch, one could escape that way. It would mean a drop, but there was a handy flower bed. She sat down, picking up her diary, and began to write in it a clear, flowing hand. One must pass the time. Suddenly, she stiffened to attention. She had heard a sound. It was, she thought, a sound like breaking glass. It had come from somewhere downstairs. She listened hard, but the sound was not repeated. She heard, or thought she heard, stealthy footsteps, the creak of stairs, the rustle of garments. There was nothing definite, and she concluded, as Blore had done earlier, that such sounds had their origin in her own imagination. But presently, she heard the sounds of a more concrete nature. People moving about downstairs, the murmur of voices, then the very decided sound of someone mounting the stairs, doors opening and shutting, feet going up to the attics overhead, more noises from there. Finally, the steps came along the passage. Lombard's voice said, Vera, you all right? Yes, what happened? Blore's voice said, Will you let us in? Vera went to the door. She removed the chair, unlocked the door, and slid back the bolt. She opened the door. The two men were breathing hard. Their feet and the bottom of the trousers were soaking wet. She said again, What's happened? Lombard said, Armstrong's disappeared. 7. Vera cried, What? Lombard said, Vanished, clean off the island. Blore concurred, Vanished, Blore's voice is difficult for me. Vanished, that's the word, like some damned conjuring trick. Vera said impatiently, Nonsense, he's hiding somewhere. Blore said, No, he isn't. I tell you, there's nowhere to hide on this island. It's as bare as your hand. There's moonlight outside, as clear as day it is. And he's not to be found. Vera said, He's doubled back to the house. Blore said, We thought of that. We searched the house too. He must have heard us. He's not here. I tell you, he's gone. Clean vanished. Vamoosed. Vera said incredulously, I don't believe it. Lombard said, It's very true, my dear. He paused, then said, Then there's the other little fact. A pane on the dining room window has been smashed. And there are only 3 little soldier boys on the table. Chapter 15. Nope, that is not what I wanted to do. There's my index. Alright, there's only this chapter 16 and the epilogue left. But I can't do all of those tonight, unfortunately. So I will be stopping here, and then we will probably just have a shorter stream next week, or I'll start whatever the next book is. And we will go from there.